Hi everyone, I'm Vince Vitale, one of the hosts of Unbelievable. Recently on the show, you may have seen Ruth Jackson host a really good debate about free will between Alex O'Connor and Alex Carter. Alex O'Connor hosts the Within Reason podcast and the highly popular YouTube channel Cosmic Skeptic, and Alex Carter is the academic director for Philosophy and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Cambridge Institute of Continuing Education. The debate was highly enjoyable and insightful. Both Alexes are excellent thinkers, though as it turns out, neither of them believe in God. So we also wanted to offer some reflections on the topic of free will from someone who does believe in God. That's me. These reflections will make sense regardless of whether you've seen the debate between Alex and Alex. At least I hope they will. But if you haven't seen it, I hope you'll go back to watch it and compare notes.
If something is random, then by definition, you're not in control of it. But if some event is not random, what that means is that something has determined it to be the case. Something has made it so that this happened rather than that happened.
There is a semantic difference between being compelled to act and being freely acting. You can look for scientific causes of my actions, and that's absolutely fair enough. But a scientific explanation of an event is one type of explanation.
So you can choose to do particular things, but when you choose to do something particular, it will be because you want to or because you're forced to. If you're forced to, you're not in control. If you do it because you want to, then given that you can't control your wants, you're not in control of that either.
We have that established already. That's kind of the starting point for where we begin. The question then becomes, where do we go wrong? And I think with philosophy, where we go wrong is we try to define free will. We're anthropologists who keep getting the wrong answer.
If a criminal has committed a crime, do you think they're responsible for their actions? And in which case, is a kleptomaniac any less to be punished than just an average thief?
This is the great trouble of the free will discussion.
After I watched it, I walked away with four main thoughts that I'd like to add to the mix as you determine what you believe about free will, why you believe it, and why it matters. So here's my first point. One of the themes of the show was the thought that people are only responsible for their actions in a moral sense if they have free will. Now, even without free will, they might be responsible in some causal sense, like the way a hurricane might be responsible for knocking down a tree. But you might think that to be morally responsible for an action, in other words, deserving of either praise or rebuke for that action, you must have performed that action freely.
If I were to sort of trip over coming off this stage, and I pushed Alex off the stage, but I sort of fell into him, he fell off the stage, then that would be pretty bad, right? But if I just got up and pushed him off the stage, that feels different. And the thing that feels different is that when I pushed him off the stage, I freely did it of my own accord. And when I fell and tripped, I didn't freely do that. That wasn't my fault. Thing is, on a practical level, this is where it makes sense to say, well, as long as the action originates with me, we'll call it free, because this is really practical. It means that I can hold somebody culpable for pushing someone, where I don't hold somebody culpable for tripping up. That's fine. So on a practical level, when it comes to our laws, when it comes to the way that we interact with each other, we can use this free will, and I think people do, they use the term free will to describe something like that, something like your actions coming from within you.
And if you accept that assumption, one line of argument you might make, if you don't believe in free will, is to argue that because free will is an incoherent notion, or because people don't have free will for whatever reason you think, therefore people are not morally responsible for their actions. Now, you might still think there should be consequences for bad actions. For example, you might think there could still be justifications for prisons, but they would be solely for the purposes of deterrence and rehabilitation, not for retribution or as a matter of what someone actually deserves. Because again, the assumption is that if we are not free, we are also not morally responsible for our actions, and therefore we should not be held morally responsible for our actions. Clear so far? Good. So the first point I want to make is that for a Christian, the necessity of free will for moral responsibility may actually surface a different line of argument, because Christians take the claims of the Bible seriously. They take the claims of the Bible to be true. And the Bible seems very clear that people do have moral responsibility for their action.
We seem to have these like moral intuitions that tell us not to do that. I think that, so if you think about why the legal system exists, why it was invented in the first place. We had a bunch of people going around murdering each other, and then collectively as a society, we realized that society would be much more stable if we had a legal system that tried to stop people from doing that. That's why it got invented. Before that happened, I think that biologically, our genes sort of did the same thing, but they did it with these things that we call moral intuitions. So on an evolutionary trajectory, those societies, those organisms, which have some kind of inexplicable desire to not murder each other, to not like when people murder each other, that kind of thing, to have a very specific emotion that makes you not like that kind of thing happening, and therefore less likely to do it, and more likely to be angry when other people do it, will make that society more stable. For the same reason that inventing a legal system that stops people from murdering each other makes society more stable, evolution building into us some kind of natural predisposition against murder, I think leads to a more stable society. And so I think that's why it evolved. And so I think you would just be left with this intuition that exists in you for whatever reason. I think it evolved, as I say, for that reason, because it leads to a more stable civilization. Organisms are more likely to survive if they have some kind of rules against that kind of stuff. And that's what gives you this desire.
There are so many passages that seem to strongly imply or even explicitly state that certain actions are praiseworthy and certain actions are sinful, and that people are morally responsible for the actions that they choose. So if Christians believe themselves to have biblical reason to affirm moral responsibility, and if moral responsibility does indeed require free will, then Christians may have a strong biblically based reason for believing in free will.
If a person is responsible for that action, they are responsible for it in the sense that a tsunami might be responsible for the destruction of a house. Right? There's a sense in which you can say that the tsunami was responsible for the destruction of the house. Was it morally responsible? Well, that would be a silly claim to make, because to attribute moral agency to something that just happened doesn't compute.
Here's one more way to think about it. Two people might both think that moral responsibility requires free will. One of those people might think they have an argument against free will and therefore conclude that there is no moral responsibility. But the other person, if they are a Christian, might reason that because the Bible affirms moral responsibility, there must be such a thing as free will. That is also a rational line of argument. And so as a Christian, I need to ask myself, am I more confident that there is a successful philosophical argument against free will, or in the biblical affirmation of moral responsibility? For many Christians, they are going to be much more confident in what the Bible affirms than in any nuanced philosophical argument against free will. I mean, even many non-theists find themselves with more confidence in the reality of moral responsibility than in any of the arguments against free will. And biblically, I would say the Christian has still more reason to be persuaded in that direction, and therefore to believe both in moral responsibility and in free will. Point number 2 that I wanted to make. We are not that smart. So often in philosophical discussions like this, there's this underlying assumption that if we can't understand something, that must mean that it's not true or it doesn't exist.
Well, why did you go to the gym? Why did you walk your dog this morning?
Because if I didn't, he wouldn't have got walked.
So what?
Yeah, I suppose I want to care for him.
You want to care for the dog,
Yeah.
right? Because you have this desire that your dog is in good health. Now you have a desire to not walk your dog at 6 in the morning, but you also have a desire that your dog be in good health. Which of those desires was stronger?
The desire to look after him.
Why?
Because I like my dog.
But why?
It's a good question.
It just was, right? It was just stronger. And in fact, had the desire to stay at home been stronger, then that's simply what you would have done. So the thing is...
That was pretty strong, just to be clear.
Yeah, no, I hope so. So, if somebody wants to be healthy, but they're feeling a bit tired, do they go to the gym? Well, what's a stronger desire? What do they want more? To be healthy or to stay in bed that morning? Whichever one they happen to want more is what they'll do. Now, often it's more complicated because there are lots of factors. Going to the gym, maybe it's raining, you want to stay dry, you want to stay in bed, you want to hang out with your friend instead. There's all these different competing desires. And so that means that even when you do something that you don't want to do, it will be driven by some kind of other desire. There's a desire for something that makes you do something you don't want to do so that you can get something you do want.
With respect to the topic at hand, free will, the assumption would be that if we can't come up with a detailed description of how free will functions, that must mean that free will doesn't exist. I think that's a very dangerous assumption. It puts an awful lot of confidence in my intellectual abilities. You could even go so far as to say it sets me up as omniscient or as the standard of all truth, because all truth claims wind up being judged according to my understanding. In what I found to be the most refreshing moment of the debate, Alex O'Connor didn't make this assumption at all.
We could be totally wrong about this, right? Suppose, for example, that, you were trying to prove the existence of consciousness, trying to prove that there were conscious beings that could see and feel and hear things, right? And I was trying to prove it to you, and somebody said, but hold on, the only thing that exists is this brain, right? It's just this brain, it's just like atoms bumping into each other. You can close your eyes right now and think of a triangle. You can see a triangle in your head. It's right there. It's got three sides. You can see it in your head. Where is that triangle? Where is it? Well, maybe it's in your head. If it were in your head, then I should be able to cut open your brain and find a triangle in there somewhere. I can't do that. Where is that triangle? It seems to sort of exist immaterially. You can see it in your head right there. So somebody might say, well, this consciousness thing, it can't exist. Because where's this triangle? You're saying that people can smell things. Where does the smell exist? Where the smell of coffee? Where's that? It's not in the coffee, because if there were no nose to smell it, there'd be no sense of the smell. But it can't be in your head either, because, again, it's not literally inside your head. I'm not going to open your brain and find the smell of coffee inside of your brain, right? So where's the smell of coffee? Where are these? Where's redness? Where's the imaginary triangle? Where are smells and sights and tastes? And on paper, it makes absolutely no sense that consciousness exists. It makes none. It's just a bunch of atoms bumping into each other, and suddenly you've got first-person conscious experience. No way, no way. It doesn't make sense. It can't exist. It literally is completely illogical.
Can I come back on that?
And yet, there it is. You're experiencing it, and you know it exists because you experience it. I'm just saying free will could be something a bit like that. Right? It's something that doesn't make any sense whatsoever on paper, but maybe it does still exist. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just saying it's worth considering.
Even though he used his brain as best he could to argue strongly against the existence of free will, there was this wonderfully refreshing moment in the debate where he questioned his own conclusion. And I absolutely loved this for a number of reasons. First, simply because he admitted publicly and while being recorded that he could be wrong. What? Mind blown. When is the last time you heard anyone do that? We desperately need more of that intellectual humility in our public life. Thank you, Alex. Second, I loved this moment because by saying that we could be wrong, we leave room for reality to be bigger and more grand and more beautiful and more awesome than merely what we can figure out with our little brains. Personally, I love surfing, my favorite hobby. And in surfing, there is something called foiling, where the board actually lifts out of the water and looks like it is magically suspended in the air as you ride. For a while, it made no sense to me how this worked. It looked like it had been photoshopped. But then I experienced it firsthand. I still didn't understand how it worked, but I knew it was real because I was seeing it with my own two eyes. Many people would say something similar about free will and moral responsibility. They might be incredibly hard to understand. They might make your head dizzy and even seem like magic. But I've experienced them firsthand. I've experienced them as clearly as I've experienced surfing on a foil. And so perhaps in philosophy too, we need to allow room for knowledge that is more experiential in nature, even if we have trouble expressing that knowledge on a page in numbered propositions.
Philosophers need therapy. We are very bad with language. We do terrible things with language, and we need to stop doing that. So we need therapeutic sort of redirection. So for instance, Everything Alex said is 100% true, but because it's 100% true and everyone already knew it, if I said to you, did you doubt before you came in here that you had a reason for doing the things that you do? Presumably you wouldn't say, oh, no, I don't think, there's always a reason why I do what I do. So the point is we have that established already. That's kind of the starting point for where we begin. The question then becomes, where do we go wrong? And I think with philosophy, where we go wrong is that we try to define free will. And so we take it as this abstract concept, and then we think about it, and we think about the concepts involved, and determinism and freedom and all these sorts of things. What do these mean? And then we try and reinsert it back into life, and it doesn't fit. And we go, what's going on there? So we're anthropologists who keep getting the wrong answer.
And finally, a third reason why I loved Alex's remarks on this point is because he made an enormously, to my mind, an enormously helpful analogy between free will and consciousness. And his argument went something like this. He said, we could be totally wrong about free will. He said, perhaps free will is like consciousness, something which is real, despite being very mysterious and extremely hard to make sense of on paper. Consciousness, in this philosophical sense, refers to the fact that humans are not just aware of things, they are also aware that they are aware. I not only interact with the world, but I experience my interaction with the world. I don't just have desires, but I know that I have them, and I can self-reflect on them. I'm not just a robot. I have an inner life. There's something that it is like to be me. And this reality raises a whole host of mysterious questions. What is this me that experiences the world? And where is this me located? Right now, I can move 2 different parts of my brain just by choosing to. If I think about a math equation, I move one part of my brain. If I think about a beautiful sunset, I move a different part of my brain just by deciding to. Isn't that amazing? And where is this me that just did that? At the most fundamental level, am I immaterial? Some sort of soul or ego? And if so, does that mean immaterial things can have causal effects on a physical world? And likewise, where are the things that we are pondering in our heads? Where is this beautiful sunset? Where is the smell of your coffee? Where is the color red? If they're in your head, shouldn't we be able to cut open your head and find them? Do not try that at home. There's a whole cluster of weird ideas surrounding the notion of consciousness. And many would say that the longer you spend thinking about them, the weirder they get. Alex's point was this. On paper, it makes absolutely no sense that consciousness exists. It's just a bunch of atoms bumping into one another in your head. It's completely illogical to think somehow that would magically produce an inner thought life. I mean, imagine if the atoms in a door in your house one day just randomly arranged themselves in such a way that the door started to think about itself and imagine sunsets. That would be crazy. Intuitively, consciousness makes no sense. And yet, there it is. You're experiencing it right now. It is undeniable based on your actual experience.
Free will is a complicated subject in many ways, but it's also incredibly simple. It's a bit like consciousness in the fact that it's simultaneously the most mysterious, mystifying thing in the world, the greatest mystery that scientists and philosophers have been battling about for centuries and more. But at the same time, the most obvious and straightforward thing in the world because you interact with the world through it.
Then Alex made his analogy. He said, free will could be like that. It could be like consciousness. Even if we have trouble making sense of it on paper, it could still exist. Consciousness seems so much like it should not exist when you try to explain it in terms of atoms and physical brains, when you try to give a purely scientific explanation of it, and yet there it is. It's impossible to deny because we are using it right now to even consider the possibility of its falsity. Could something similar be true of free will? Even if we struggle to give an exact analysis of it, there it is. We are experiencing it. Perhaps we're even using free will right now as we freely choose to spend our time thinking about free will. I don't want us to miss this. This is a very significant point that Alex O'Connor is making because it has implications far beyond the specific question of free will. So often when we approach deep questions of life, we assume that if we can't conceive of how something works, then it probably doesn't exist. We need to break ourselves of that intellectual habit. I mean, most people can't conceive of how this thing works, how my smartphone works, and yet there it is, sending information through the air all day long. And to go one step further, if you're a Christian, I think you have even more reason to deny the assumption that we should only believe in what we can thoroughly understand and to embrace beliefs that are way beyond what we can understand. As a Christian, I am deeply committed to this. First and foremost, because I believe in a God who is infinite and limitless. In fact, if I could fully conceive of how God works, that would actually be conclusive evidence that whatever I'm conceiving of, it's not God. And I believe God is omnipotent. So I believe he can make all sorts of things true of reality that are well beyond my intellectual grasp. And perhaps consciousness and free will are two of those things. God can bring into existence a much wider range of things than a finite universe can. And God might also have a particular interest in free will because of the role that it seems to play in meaningful relationships. So if you believe in God, I would say that even if you find free will baffling, you might still have very good reason for being open to the reality of it, because even if we're not that smart, I believe that God is.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
My third point is about the relationship between whether or not free will exists and whether or not God exists. This theme did not take center stage in the debate between Alex Carter and Alex O'Connor, but as a Christian, it's one of the very first places that my mind goes. What is the impact of whether or not we believe in free will on whether or not we should believe in God?
If something is random, then by definition, you're not in control of it. But if some event is not random, what that means is that something has determined it to be the case. Something has made it so that this happened rather than that happened.
There is a semantic difference between being compelled to act and being freely acting. You can look for scientific causes of my actions, and that's absolutely fair enough. But a scientific explanation of an event is one type of explanation.
You can choose to do particular things, but when you choose to do something particular, it will be because you want to or because you're forced to. If you're forced to, you're not in control. If you do it because you want to, then given that you can't control your wants, you're not in control of that either.
Now, often it seems to be just assumed that God's existence relies on the existence of free will, that there's some sort of obvious logical implication such that if free will does not exist, neither does God. I want to question this. I at least want to suggest that the inference is not as obvious as we tend to assume. Here's why. Alex O'Connor's position, like many who argue against free will, is not just that we lack evidence for free will, or that it is improbable, but rather that it is a logical impossibility, that there is no logically coherent way to define the term, to parse out what is meant by an act being free. As he puts it, my position is not just that free will doesn't exist, it's that it cannot exist. But this claim of logical impossibility may surprisingly work in God's favor, in at least one sense. A famous argument against the omnipotence or all-powerfulness of God proceeds by asking the following question: can God make a stone that is too heavy for him to lift? Do you see the problem? The question is supposed to back the believer in God into a corner. Either God can make such a stone or he can't. If God can't make such a stone, there's something he can't do. He can't make the stone, and therefore he is not all-powerful. But if he can make such a stone, there's still something he can't do. Then he can't lift the stone. Either way, there's something God can't do, and therefore God is lacking in power. It is generally accepted that this is a bad argument. And the reason it is a bad argument is because there's a hidden logical inconsistency in the initial question. God is by definition all-powerful. And so the question is really asking, can God make a stone too heavy for a being with limitless power to lift? Which is really just a way of asking whether God can be both limited and limitless at the same time, which then reveals that hidden amidst the cuteness of the initial phrasing of the question is the fact that what is really being asked is whether God can bring about a logical contradiction.
The problem with appealing to or rejecting it as just semantics is that you're rejecting the very words that we're using to utter these sentences that we're both using right now. So there's a lovely line by one philosopher who says, yes, that's what free will means, but it's not what free will is. And I said, but the problem is you've just used the term free will twice. You use the same term each time, and that's your problem. You need to be able to explain that. So I totally agree that we can use science to explain events, but I also think there are some things which science can't explain just because it's the wrong tool for that mode of explanation.
It's like asking whether God can make a square circle. Well, no, he can't. But that's not because there's something he can't do. It's because a square circle is not a thing. The sentence has failed to actually identify something for God to do. It's like asking, can God purple jump? Can God purple jump? Well, sure, you can put the words purple and jump next to each other in a sentence, but they don't actually signify anything. They are not a thing, and so you haven't identified a thing that God can't do. Purple, jump, square, circles, and stones too heavy to be lifted by an omnipotent being are all incoherent phrases. So if you're not concerned that God can't purple jump or make a square circle, you also should not be concerned that he can't make a stone that he can't lift. Got it? Good. So how does this all relate to free will? Well, if Alex is right that free will is actually a logical impossibility, an incoherent notion, words that we can speak but not actually something that can be coherently defined, then free will is like a square circle. And then perhaps the believer in God can give a parallel response. Maybe she can say, look, if free will is simply impossible, then it doesn't count against God that he didn't make us with free will. That doesn't count against his goodness any more than him not being able to make a square circle counts against his power. It's not that God could have made us with free will and chose not to. It's just that when we use the term free will, we think we are signifying something when we are not. And therefore, us not having free will does not count against God's existence any more than him not being able to make a square circle or an unliftable stone. Now let's take this one step further. This line of argument, it's not just a hypothetical. In fact, interestingly, quite a large number of Christian theologians throughout history have held to some form of determinism. A lot of people don't realize that. We could get pretty deep in the weeds of what exactly they believed, and what needs to be nuanced for each thinker is often open to interpretation. But it's safe to say that plenty of smart theologians throughout history did not see any sort of obvious logical inference from things being determined to the non-existence of God. Now, if there is an argument from determinism or a lack of some type of free will to the non-existence of God, typically it is centered on the evil and suffering in our world. Typically, the objection is that free will is the only good reason God could have for allowing evil to exist. And so if free will doesn't exist, if meaningful free will can't be God's motivation for allowing evil, then any attempt to respond to the problem of evil would be undermined. But one more time, that's not as obvious as you might think. There are several responses to the problem of evil that don't rely on free will. And in fact, my own response, which is the philosophical theory I've spent more time working on than any other, actually fits just as naturally in a deterministic framework as in a free will framework. I won't go into any of the details here, but the basic idea is that God wanted you to exist individually because he loves you. And if the history of the world had been much different, you could not have come to exist. Someone else might have, but not you. And so if God wanted you to exist because he longed for the opportunity to invite you into a loving and eternal relationship with him, then he had to allow much of the pain, the very real pain of human history. There's actually a strong analogy in this respect between divine creation on the one hand and human procreation on the other. Because if you find yourself thinking it is evil to create people into a world that you know will produce serious suffering in their lives, if that is your position, if you affirm that statement, then you are not only taking a moral stance against God, but also against any human parent who intentionally has a child. I develop this analogy further and suggest that if you think it can be a good thing for human parents to bring a child into this world, despite its grave suffering, then you may have just as much or even more reason to believe that God could be good and loving, despite likewise creating us into this often harsh and painful world. I don't have time to dive into the details of this approach now, but it's called non-identity theodicy. And if you're interested, you can easily find the book and the article online. And I also just came across a very helpful YouTube video about it on Apologetics Squared. To summarize this point, it is often assumed that if free will doesn't exist, neither does God. But that is significantly less clear than you might think, and certainly worth some extended conversation and consideration. Okay, my fourth and last reflection on the excellent free will debate between Alex O'Connor and Alex Carter. And I'll just raise this point briefly as a question for further consideration.
If somebody wrongs you or does something bad to you, if you can remind yourself that they might not have had control over the determining factors that made them do that, it might make you into a more charitable and kind person. Someone barges past you on the street, or someone is cruel to you, then remembering that they're not fully in control, at least fully in control of the action that they committed, will make you into a kinder person, a more forgiving person. It will help you to understand people better, and I think that that's a worthwhile thing to embody.
If God does not exist, and all of life is determined by materialistic or naturalistic causes, if that's the case, then why should we trust any of the reasoning in this debate, or in any debate for that matter? If our brains have developed solely through the natural causes of a universe that at bottom is random and unguided, then why should we trust that what our brains recommend to us is actually reliable or true? There is so much that we don't know. If you draw one circle on a piece of paper that represents the totality of all there is to be known, and then draw another circle inside of it that represents all that we know, the first circle would absolutely dwarf the proportionally minuscule circle of our knowledge. And on top of that, there are really complex debates about whether exclusively naturalistic causes, devoid of any supernatural purpose, would develop our brains to be aimed at beliefs that are true, or rather at beliefs that are merely conducive to our survival. And those are two importantly different categories. And if our brains are aimed at survival rather than truth, then is trusting our brains for truth actually a bit like stepping on a scale and expecting it to tell you the time? That would be highly irrational. Why? Because scales are aimed at weight, not time. Well, what if our brains are aimed at survival, not truth? That's just to raise the question. There is a copious, complex, and ongoing debate on this topic, and it's a critical debate because it lies at the foundation of our very reasoning processes, and therefore whether we can trust not just this or that conclusion on this or that specific topic, but whether we can trust any of our conclusions, whether we ever have reason to think that our brains are actually telling us the truth, and especially when it comes to abstract philosophical questions about the nature and meaning of reality. That debate will continue, along with many others. And as they do, for me, as a Christian, I am very thankful to believe that someone who is able to see the full, enormous circle of the totality of knowledge was willing to humble himself and step into the little circle of what I know so that he could reliably point us toward truth and even invite us personally to know it and to experience it with respect to so many of the deepest and most important questions of life.